This is WBSM On Demand.
Good morning. Good morning. So we're now joined here in studio by Will Sennott, who writes for the New Bedford Light. Great friend of the program, really a good journalist. We really appreciate, Will, you making your time available to us. Good morning, my friend. How are you?
Hey, morning, Chris. I'm good.
So you have been covering the 8th Bristol District. That is, for people who don't know, that's the Westport, Freetown, Fall River, north end of New Bedford, and the Acushnet State Representative District. Where are we this morning, Will?
Well, as of this morning, the elected to be state representative is Steve Willett. He's the Westport candidate. He's on the Westport Select Board. Comes from a long background of kind of the volunteer community there, many different committees. And he won by a very, very narrow margin over Chris Thrasher, the Republican candidate who staged a very last-minute write-in campaign effort during the primary.
Incredible candidate. Incredible campaign, really.
Yeah, I mean, very last minute. He saw there was no Republican challenger.
Right.
Went right to work and got himself on the ballot for the election, and lost by just 143 votes, which is less than 1% of the total votes. I mean, incredibly slim. There's quite a few independent challengers in the midst. There's 3, most notably Jesse St. Gelais, who had a really overwhelming support in his hometown of Acushnet. Interestingly enough, might have actually made the difference in the election between Thrasher and
I
Willett.
agree with you, yeah.
But as this morning, Chris Thrasher sent out a notice, last night, that he will be pursuing a hand recount. He had quite a few reasons why. We can get into it, but
yeah, absolutely. He's totally entitled to that recount. I mean, less than 1%. Right? He absolutely has to ask for that recount.
Yeah, so it's funny. The 143 votes comes out to 0.6%. And I talked with the Secretary of State's office last night, and they automatically pursue a district-wide recount if the margin is less than 0.5%. So he's just over that
really?
amount. Yeah. He's still be able to pursue it. He'll have to go precinct by precinct, gather signatures in each of those precincts. But yeah, he just missed the margin by which he would be guaranteed a district-wide recount from the Secretary of State's office.
So explain that to us. We have Will Sennott here from the New Bedford Light talking about the election. So Chris Thrasher, who I think is entitled to a recount, but you're saying legally he's not entitled to it. He has to get signatures?
Yeah, I mean, of course he's entitled to it.
Right.
But yeah, he does have to, what the Secretary of State's office said yesterday is that he has to gather 10 signatures per precinct.
Okay.
And in those precincts he's able to gather signatures, he will get a recount. It shouldn't be too hard. No. It's it's fairly, it's just the way it goes down. I was saying if he had lost by 0.1% less, he would be guaranteed a district-wide recount from the state, from the state level.
But I mean, I've been in elections, been involved in covering elections, participating in elections. That is probably the closest one I've ever seen.
You would know better than me.
Right, but it's really close.
Yeah.
So how did that race shape up for you? You covered the race. What were the back and forths in that race? What were the big issues, Will?
Yeah, so, I mean, the candidates, they're actually pretty aligned on quite a few issues, namely offshore wind. Every candidate, I went to some of the debates hosted by Phil Paleologos, and it was clear all candidates, supported the Second Amendment very strongly. Also were very strongly against offshore wind.
Yes.
It was just varying scales of their resistance.
Right.
Where they differed really is in their really just their political alignments. It seemed Steve Willett, of course, he was this kind of establishment figure.
Yes,
he was endorsed by Paul Schmid, the former state rep for the 8th Bristol District. Roderick's had his endorsement.
Yep, Senator Roderick.
And he, just a lot of support from kind of the, the Democratic stronghold of Westport.
Right.
Former Mayor John Bullard was one of his donors. Thrasher campaigned kind of against that idea as a whole. That was the premise of why he got involved. He, his big quote or his big kind of defining, the way he defined himself was, fighting against the one-party supermajority.
Yep.
In which very little gets done. That was he reiterated that point quite a bit during his campaign, and he wanted to just kind of essentially campaign on the this seat, which has been held by Democrats for the better part of 3 decades.
Right.
And yeah, he made a pretty significant step. I mean, Schmid had been losing ground for quite a bit. He, of course, won. But every election his last 2 were against Evan Gendro,
yes.
right, the Westport school committee member, rather young guy. And yeah, every election had been, Gendro had been gaining ground. And Gendro backed out during the primary. He planned to run.
He did.
And he actually ended up taking over as campaign manager to Thrasher's campaign.
Right.
And they got that one step closer, but didn't quite get there.
That if you take everybody's positions in that, I would put Jesse St. Gelais on the conservative side. I would put the other selectman, Manny Soers, kind of on the conservative side. That is now a conservative district, even though Steve Ouellette may prevail finally in the recount and be the Democrat who gets it. Of course, Steve is not like a flaming liberal either. No, he's not. I mean, he described himself as a very well-balanced. I mean, he's the facilities director of the region's public schools. I think right now he's in Acushnet. Previously, he was at Westport, maybe Dartmouth, I believe. A different of the region's school districts, and he's a pragmatist. That's how he describes himself. He's focused on the hard things of politics, the roads, infrastructure. He's not one of these. He's not like a radical by any means. He's not AOC by any means. I wouldn't describe him that way. Right. But yeah, he's it is a district that is pushing ever closer to being a Republican district. That was what was so interesting about this race. I mean, if you look at the numbers, I have them right here. It was neck and neck between Ouellette and Thrasher in just about every town. Of course, Ouellette won the more Democratic towns, New Bedford, Fall River, and Westport. Yep. Thrasher won, or bested Ouellette in Freetown, Acushnet, and I believe just Freetown and Acushnet. It was, yeah. However, we say he lost by 143 votes. What really stood out in these numbers was Acushnet, where Jesse St. Gelais had almost double the votes of both Ouellette and Thrasher. He had 1,870 votes in Acushnet. Thrasher had 937, and Ouellette had 808. So Acushnet's a pretty conservative town. Yes. And I imagine, this is what people say about independent candidates, right? Like Jill Stein in the presidential election, or Bobby Kennedy if he had been on the ballot. I mean, really, St. Gelais' support is probably what cost Thrasher the election. There's no doubt about it, which is why I say that in 2 years from now, because that's how quick the rep seats come up again, they're going to have to figure that out. There'll likely be a primary. I don't know. But Thrasher, should he prevail in the recount, even if he doesn't, he's the odds-on favorite in 2 years. I'd say. Should he stick around? Yeah, should he stick around? And he's an interesting candidate. I mean, very interesting guy. Yeah, he's very new to Westport. He moved there in 2021. He very quickly got involved in local politics. He filled a vacant seat on the school committee. He has a kind of perception as a carpetbagger. Yeah. That's how people have described him, the same way Ouellette has been described as kind of the ordained political candidate. Right. Thrasher has been described as it's kind of unclear why he moved. He went to UMass Law. Yes. He got his law degree there. He's just he's really jumped in very quickly into the waters of local politics in the area. He's a political mechanic. That's how I describe him. That's a compliment. He's a very smart guy when it comes to electioneering. He's made a lot of money around the country doing it for a variety of candidates. Yeah, I mean, he's worked on a stage much bigger than the Bristol 8th District. That's what I see. He's, his job, he's a ballot access attorney. And he's done political consulting for quite a few, mostly independent candidates, which you talked about with him on your show. Most recently, and I'll say this correctly because he had an issue with the way I phrased it in some stories I wrote, but his firm was paid by a super PAC that funded Bobby Kennedy's campaign for president, which, of course, didn't pan out, and received some $500,000. And I mean, that's, sure, he was running the Bristol 8th state rep race, but even most recently as this election, was involved with one of the biggest candidates in the presidential election. Yeah, I mean, he's a smart guy, and I like him. So whatever happens, I think Chris Thrasher, he said to me, he goes, look, Westport's my home now. Here's where I'm going to raise my family, and I'm going to stay, right? So I think that's very positive.
Yeah, I mean, the way he told it to me is I've lived in Westport longer than I have anywhere in my adult life.
Right.
Which, for a roaming politician,
Right.
Take it as you will.
I know that when he was a libertarian activist, he gave a speech saying, look, I've been in with the California delegation. I think he's been with the New York delegation. In other words, he's been all around, right? And he made that point to make another point at the Libertarian Convention. But look, I think Chris Thrasher's a smart guy. He's a skilled political mechanic. He's very much involved in a lot of other issues. So this is going to be an amazing race. It's not over. When do you figure it's going to be over?
I really don't know. I mean, I've never covered a recount.
Okay.
Honestly, I don't know how it'll shake out. I imagine he'll collect a number of signatures, and I spoke to, for example, the town clerk in Westport.
Okay.
And there are still ballots being counted. In most elections, that doesn't make a difference. The few mail-in ballots and other ballots that are still kind of pending, usually it doesn't make much of a difference. But when it comes down to 143 votes,
it make all the difference.
It really could. Yeah. And Thrasher, in his announcement for demanding a recount, he made quite a few called accusations.
Okay.
He had some reports. He said of I don't want to call them errors or problems with the polling places. For one, he said that I guess the most serious one he said is that he heard reports of, quote, spoiled ballots. You know what a spoiled ballot is?
Explain it.
For the listeners, it's a ballot where somebody makes an error or for some reason the machine can't read it. You put it into the machine and it rejects the ballot. So
right.
They write in big letters "spoiled" over the page. They put it in a separate. You can't throw it away. You put it in a separate pile. It doesn't get counted, and the person submits a new ballot. Thrasher said that he heard reports that in some polling places they had re-entered or recast spoiled ballots. I really pushed him for more details. He did not want to give me any more details on it. It's a bit frustrating because it's a pretty serious accusation.
It is.
I spoke to the Westport town clerk, who's only, this came out yesterday afternoon that he was doing this, so we didn't have much time to talk to town clerks yet. But, she told me in the town clerk in Westport that they had absolutely no instances of that happening.
Okay. But there are so many communities in this district.
There are, yeah. There are quite a few.
You've got New Bedford, Fall River, Acushnet, Freetown, and Westport.
Yeah, unfortunately, all their offices close at about 4 o'clock. So
I get it, Will. I get it. We're going to take a break, and we have Will Sennott from the New Bedford Light. Check out all of his articles over there at the New Bedford Light. They do a great job over there. Will does a great job. We'll take a break. We'll be right back. If you want to get involved in this conversation, you can at 508-996-0500. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. I'm Chris McCarthy. We have Will Sennott here from the New Bedford Light. He covered the 8th Bristol District race. He also covers fishing. So how does the election impact, the Trump election, do you think, impact the fishing industry and some of the work you've done on that? You've done a lot of research into the fishing industry. Yeah,
I mean, I've covered the fishing industry. It's going to be 4 years in January. Yeah, and I've gotten to know quite a few people in that community. I've worked on some fishing boats myself, and
I love that about
it's such an interesting beat, and I've really loved covering it. I wrote some stories this election about the fishing industry's vote, and it was wasn't much of a diverse perspective, I will say.
Right.
I couldn't find a single fisherman who was casting their ballot for Kamala Harris. They're really the only difference in opinion was those who were strongly in support of Trump, those who were cautiously in support for Trump,
right,
and those who just didn't vote at all. Really what that, boils down to, I guess, two things. One is this kind of anti-government impulse that courses through the fishing industry, which, you can, it's quite a complex point. We can get into it if you like, but, it really comes down to just, Trump has, seen as this outsider in politics, trying to stir up the system, and fishermen, you can see it on the bumper stickers on some cars, right? Nymphs, right? NOAA Fisheries.
Okay.
This bumper sticker destroying fishermen's lives since 1976.
Okay.
The fishing industry, it's one of these things where the federal government isn't this kind of obscure figure. Very literally, when you think of observers being forced to be on boats, quite literally, the government is on the boats looking over their shoulder for.
They are right on the boats.
Yeah.
Right on the boats.
So, this anti-government impulse is very strong in the fishing industry. Regulations, which, some fisheries are, really tight and restrictive, that really handicap fishermen's livelihoods. And many said, if they're going to handicap our livelihoods, we want a figure like Trump who's going to handicap their agency right back.
Right.
The other thing is offshore wind. I mean, if there's one thing that has, defined the politics of the fishing industry, it's their resistance to the offshore wind industry. I mean, more flags than you see for Donald Trump flying on the back of fishing vessels are the anti-offshore wind flags.
Right.
That, the big white flag with a windmill on a red circle with a line through it. And Trump has vowed, he said at a campaign or a rally in New Jersey that he's going to put an end to offshore wind on day one.
Yes.
We'll see if that really happens.
Right.
I mean, I have my doubts personally, just because this is it's not something you can sign out through executive order. There's a lot. I mean, of bureaucracy around it. Vineyard Wind's already built. I mean, it's already feeding power into the grid. I mean, it's going to be a lot harder than to just write it out in executive order as he pledged to do. But that's was his vow, and that has gained him really overwhelming support from the fishing industry.
It is. You did a lot of work on the importation of Japanese scallops.
Yeah.
Talk about that if you could. The Biden administration helping with that.
So that was a story. It was a few months ago. Yeah. It was about in the winter there was a pretty sharp decline in scallop prices, which of course the port of New Bedford lives and dies by the price of scallops every year.
Right.
And there's a lot of troubles for the scallop industry right now. For one, there's a declining biomass, which and there's lower. They're this year, as of in addition to the year before, have lowered the days at sea. The amount of landings of scallops has declined by 50% in the last 2 years. It's a serious, a lot of fishermen are feeling the pinch. Captains are doubling, even tripling up on boats. Crews are even quadrupling up on boats to make the same income they did 4 years ago.
Right.
And on top of that, there's been this massive influx in imports of scallops coming in from places like Japan, Peru, to kind of backfill the supply that now isn't being met domestically.
Right.
And it's had, these scallops from Japan are really cheap. They're, it was ushered in by the ambassador to Japan, who was trying to help. It's a very complex political situation. You're putting me on the spot here because I haven't thought about it a little bit.
It's Rahm Emanuel, who was chief of staff to President Obama. He was the mayor of Chicago. Really a serious political operative in the Democrat Party.
Yeah, and Japan was going through this situation where they were beginning to release their nuclear wastewater from the Fukushima disaster about 10 years ago, maybe even longer at this point. And in response, China imposed a ban on seafood imports from Japan as retaliation for releasing this nuclear waste into their shared ocean. Their markets, this Japanese seafood markets tanked because China, just like the U.S., is one of their biggest buyers. And Rahm Emanuel sought to bail them out by promoting the import of Japanese seafood into the U.S. and also the U.S. military bases.
Yep.
And there wasn't any tax incentives or any federal money that went towards it, but there was the kind of blessing of the U.S. ambassador who ushered it. And as far as there was ads, I think we talked about there's ads during the Super Bowl for Japanese seafood in the U.S.
Yep.
And that had a big impact on the prices of scallops in an already challenging year. When it comes to Trump, there's a few things. I mean, tariffs is probably one of Trump's favorite words.
Absolutely. I mean, he says a beautiful word as a negotiating tool.
He loves it. And during his last term, he imposed tariffs on quite a few places, namely China. In a response, China imposed tariffs on the U.S. seafood imports into China, and that had a pretty serious impact on the on seafood. The U.S. seafood trade is really dependent on its exports, namely to China. Not just for consumption in China, but a lot of our fish gets processed in China and even sent right back, which would still have to pay the same tariffs. And the perception of tariffs, yes, they could boost domestic prices by limiting, disincentivizing imports from other places. But as the last term showed, it's a complex thing. And if a nation like China were to impose more tariffs on our seafood, that would have an even bigger hit on the seafood prices here in New Bedford. So it's there's no right answer, I'm afraid. But
no, there's no right answer. It's an amazing situation, though, and I think you have covered it really well. what I'm told about the for instance, the Japanese scallop is that it's a good product, particularly if you're going to fry them or anything like that. These are from seafood buyers and seafood dealers who have said it. They've said it here on the program, and they've told me personally that it's not a bad product. But it's not as good as the scallops that get landed in New Bedford.
No, absolutely not. I mean, maybe I'm biased. I'll state it, but yeah, I mean, New Bedford scallops are the biggest, healthiest. I mean, they're better tasting than Japanese. I mean, they're the premium grade.
Premium grade, yes.
The global scallop, and there's quite a few different varieties of scallops. There's bay scallops, of course. The Peruvian scallops. There's recently this push for aquaculture. Like farm grown scallops, but nothing compares to the real thing.
And you've actually been out there.
I have, yeah. I've done some scalloping.
What's it like working on a scallop boat? Hard?
Brutal. I mean, there's no way to describe it other than just,
Tell me about your hands. Tell me about your hands.
Yeah, I mean, I went, my last trip was in February. It was a snowstorm. We were out there for about 8 days. I went, my editors let me, do fishing trips to, learn more about my beat.
Right.
And I worked, harder than I ever have, really. And I've done plenty of manual labor in my life, but there's nothing that compares to, 15-hour shifts, 16-hour shifts with 4.5 hours off. And then your day is not over. You're right back to another 15-hour shift for 8 days straight. I mean, it's nonstop. It's freezing cold, snowing outside. I came back, I had exactly 1 week off to do this trip. I came back on Monday, sat down on my computer to write a story and get back into work, and my hands were so swollen I couldn't type. I'd try to press the letter W, and Q, E, R, S, and D would all be pressed at the same time.
I hate to laugh, but I mean that you got right involved and you went out there.
Yeah, I loved it. As hard as it is, it was an awesome experience. The crew was incredibly tough. The captain was really tough. They didn't take it easy on me, and I didn't want them to, of course.
Sure.
And yeah, you just got to have incredible respect for the work that these guys.
Will Sennott is with the New Bedford Light. He's been covering the fishing industry now and politics as well, offshore wind, all the rest of it. You can read him at the New Bedford Light. You may have a book in the works.
I've been working on a book. I was reached out to by a publisher at Penguin about a few months ago, asked me to write a book about my last few years of covering the waterfront, the Port of New Bedford. Namely this story that we published about 2 years ago on this conflict between private equity kind of merging and taking large control of the waterfront.
Right.
Blue Harvest was the company we covered that, of course, since gone belly up.
Yeah.
And taking a lot of people out with them, of course, which is the problem with private equity. I plan to be focused on writing a book, and I would love to come on the show and talk about it if I'm able to pull it off.
Well, you're always welcome here. Carter's Clothing and Footwear, they've been in business for 77 years, owned and operated since 1947, covering all your work and casual needs. Carter Clothing and Footwear, it's a great place to do your Christmas shopping. They have brands like Carhartt and Chippewa, Timberland, Levi's, Champion, Under Armour. They have over 75 different styles of work boots, including steel toe, non-steel toe, insulated, uninsulated. Carter's Clothing and Footwear, it's a brand you can trust, right? They're located 2 locations. They've got a location on 55 William Street in downtown New Bedford and 288 Plymouth Avenue in Fall River. Both locations have free parking. Spin in, spin right out, right? Both locations have consistently friendly, helpful customer service at both stores. They've got great New Bedford gear when you go to the store in New Bedford. Oftentimes, you'll find the owner, Kevin Carter, one of the family members, on location. So Carter's Clothing and Footwear is a brand you can do business with. You can trust them. Great place to get a gift certificate for the holidays. Shop small, shop local, shop Carter's Clothing and Footwear. Stick around. We'll be right back. And you're the audience, and we have Will Sennott from the New Bedford Light here in studio. So what are the policy changes do you think the fishing industry will be looking for from the new President Trump?
Yeah, so I mean, policy is I think peripheral to the fishing industry's support of Trump. Like I said, It's really about offshore wind, which we'll see what kind of policy could really get rid of that, if any. Also, this kind of anti-government impulse. But the most kind of acute or real thing that Trump has done, this was in his last term, was he reversed a ban on commercial fishing in the marine national monuments.
Yes.
It's a really interesting story. Obama, it was this area. It's a massive area. The canyons, tuna fishing grounds, crabbing, red crab, lobster. It's this massive area that under Obama it was established as a protected area, marine national monument. And then they then banned commercial fishing within that monument. That was reversed under the Trump administration the first time, and that happened after he went up to Maine to speak with the fishermen up in Maine. It was really to quell frustrations about this whole tariffs thing we recently discussed that was having a big, causing big problems for especially the Maine lobster fishery, because they are heavily reliant on China for exporting their seafood.
Okay.
But at the end of their whole conversation, all the councils, the regional regulatory councils, asked, if there's one thing Trump could do. They said you could repeal this ban on fishing in the marine national monuments. He did it. Under the Biden administration, it was reestablished.
Oh, it was, yeah.
It was, yeah. And so the idea is, the most, the thing that people are expecting Trump to do when it comes to policy is, overturning the overturn of a ban on fishing in the marine national monument.
So there's a letter that recently went out from the Port of New Bedford, really from the mayor of New Bedford, talking about citing offshore wind in different areas, trying to resist the federal government from citing it in the next area they want to do it. Do you know much about that? Can you talk much about it?
Yeah, this is about the most recent leasing area for offshore wind, which is in the Mid-Atlantic, which is an area that's open to scalloping. It's a very large area that the BOEM, which is the regulatory agency, cited as the new area for offshore wind development. They just started soliciting proposals to lease the area to developers, and it's an area that overlaps, very significantly with very lucrative, specifically scallop grounds. The letter described that in the last 10 years, that area's produced some $2 billion in commercial fishing revenue.
Right. A
large amount of that being scallops. I think it was $1.5 billion worth of that was scallops. It's areas like Elephant Trunk, which is kind of an iconic fishing ground. This offshore wind leasing area is smack dab in the center of these fishing grounds. And the mayor's office, the Port of New Bedford, they sent a letter to BOEM citing, I think it was, quote, grave concerns about its impact. And this is, an administration, Mayor Mitchell's administration, which is, of course, favorable to offshore wind.
Right.
I've always believed in a pretty rational way. He has this perspective of wanting to diversify the industries of the port, which is, important for an economy, not to be dependent on one thing. We've seen what happens in places, they call it Dutch disease, right?
Okay.
It's, when an economy is entirely dependent on one thing. This letter was very strong when it comes.
It was extraordinarily strong. I agree.
And they even went as far as to kind of take a jab at BOEM for. They accused them of essentially putting the lease area in these fishing grounds to then later remove parts of it, so that they could have the perception of quote, we were listening to fishermen.
The mayor said it right here, basically.
Yeah, it's a really just sharp observation, because that's a lot of how these federal agencies work. It's a negotiation deal, right? And they know what they want, and they know what they need, and they know how to set the parameters of the negotiation as far to one side, so that when it looks like they're giving the fishermen back some fishing grounds, as opposed to taking them away, which is what will be doing.
Certainly, former Assistant U.S. Attorney John Mitchell understands that the power of the federal government when it comes to negotiating with civilians, which is what he called them out on, basically.
Yeah. It was, I've covered offshore wind and fishing for a long time. It was one of the sharpest observations I've seen to how this whole process works for leasing areas and the conflict between the fishing industry and offshore wind, and really showed, BOEM has very little regard for the for the fishing industry. I mean,
it's amazing.
We've had some stories we co-published with ProPublica about the kind of powers that be within BOEM. A lot of them have worked for offshore wind developers.
The revolving door.
It's quite a revolving door, and it's funny, revolving doors are nothing new in politics, right? No. And I'm not going to say it's, the revolving door between oil and politics is, it's on a scale incomparable to the offshore wind and or war and the military-industrial complex and politics. Right. Offshore wind is relatively small in comparison, but there is it's where the money is right now, and there's a lot of people in BOEM right now who have are driven to get these projects built and to meet these goals of 30 by 30, right? Building out the nation's clean energy grids.
We have Will Sennott from the New Bedford Light here in studio. He covers the waterfront, offshore wind, does a great job with it. You should check out all his articles. They're all archived up there, right?
Bedford Light? Yeah, of course.
So the who is sticking up for the fishing industry on the federal level?
It's a good question.
Right.
That's really what I heard from fishermen is, it's kind of funny. You think about the State House in Boston, the House of Representatives, rather. There's a sacred cod, right? An effigy, a wooden carving of a cod hanging from the ceiling like a chandelier up there. But there are very few allies to the fishing industry, on the state level, let alone on the federal or the executive level. The last kind of coalition of politicians that supported the fishing industry were, the Massachusetts politicians about 10 to 15 years ago. That's Barney Frank, Senator Kennedy. As I spoke to some fishermen, like Tony Alvarez is one.
Tony's a great guy.
Mid-sized fleet here in New Bedford, and they spoke about how they were all Democrats until recently, until the last 10 years or so. Tony Alvarez said he was an immigrant from Portugal.
I know Tony very well. I have lunch with him usually most Fridays.
Yeah, he grew up, he said his whole life, it was a relatively poor immigrant and always voting Democrat. That's what he believed in. He believed the Democratic Party was the party of the helping the poor and the working class, which I believe they have been in the past. And when he started fishing, they were also the party like Barney Frank and like Ted Kennedy, who came, he said they used to come down to the docks, they'd get on the boats, they'd talk to us, they'd support us, they'd fight for us.
Yep.
And right now there's really, there's no one on the, either of the U.S. senators in Massachusetts or the even really on the local or state level politicians that have made fishing a priority. We're talking about the Bristol 8th District. Paul Schmid was an incredible advocate for the agricultural community.
He was.
And he tried to parlay that into some into aiding the fishing industry in a similar way, but it's a complicated it's a complicated web to get tangled in. The fishing industry is a lot of
no pun intended.
Yeah, it's you really have to devote a lot of time to wrap your head around the fishing industry, let alone be able to advocate for it in Congress or in the Senate. And there just really isn't anyone in office right now who's, it's in the U.S. even standing up against offshore wind, let alone advocating for the fishing industry.
It is this cult of the new Green Deal. It's really wild. It really is wild. It's almost like a new religion.
And that's why Trump was able to gain such overwhelming support, because when he says we're going to sign out offshore wind in day one, that's more than any of the politicians in Massachusetts really have done for the fishing industry.
It is I think it's a major part of the gross domestic product of Massachusetts, fishing. And yet it's almost like politicians want nothing to do with it. It's weird.
Yeah, it's seen, I think it's
with the exception of this letter from the mayor, obviously.
Yeah, and the mayor really does have a very strong understanding of the fishing industry.
He does.
It really, gets the whole scope of it from the history of regulations and how they've affected the industry. I've always been impressed with his understanding of the fishing industry. He taught me a lot when I first moved here and started learning about it.
We were just talking about how you ended up on a fishing boat, though.
Because
I love that about you, that you actually got so interested in your story. You go, I got to go on this boat.
Yeah.
It's Hemingway-esque, I have to tell you that.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
They should be driving an ambulance in the Ukraine.
Yeah. I think it is interesting that there's this perception that the Democratic Party has turned its back on the fishing industry. And I think that's the perception of a lot of Democratic voters, and clearly the Democratic Party has been losing its stronghold in regions like the South Coast. Right? Our columnist Jack Spillane had a very in-depth article about Trump gaining momentum here, and I hope I'm not injecting too much of my own political opinion, but they have clearly failed to provide very strong candidates, and ever since Trump has entered the political arena. And that's translating to, the growing support for Trump in industries that used to be represented very strongly and have incredible support from, like the fishing industry, for example.
Arthur Hirsch has an article today with Chris Markey saying we got to relook at our policies. State Representative Chris Markey, who's a longtime Democrat, but a normal guy, not on the hard left at all. Mm-hmm. And that they've got to rethink these policies.
Yeah, I think, that's I believe we're reading as the silver lining of this election is that it's maybe finally an inflection point or a moment to take stock and maybe usher the Democratic Party to make more of a stand for things that the voters care about.
We got some people on hold here. Good morning. Thanks for holding.
Yeah, Chris. Thank you for bringing them on. Young man, you're doing a phenomenal job.
Thank you.
I was watching C-SPAN about a year ago. You had Senator Ed Markey. He's more concerned about these big fish processing plants that get their fish from China, Japan, and Russia, believe it or not. And Ed Markey's not for our fishermen, for the guy that gets up in the morning and hard work out there in rough seas. I want your take on that. Ed Markey's not a friend of our American fishermen. He's out for the big international processing plants. Can you elaborate, Mr. Markey?
Thanks for the call.
Yeah, Senator Markey, I have a lot of respect for Senator Markey personally.
Sure, of course.
He is certainly in favor of offshore wind. Every time he comes down here, he's usually speaking at some sort of unveiling of a new offshore wind terminal, or that's he's very involved in the Green New Deal. He hasn't shown much support for the fishing industry. That's a fact. It's not where his priorities lie. You mentioned the fish processing plants. It's actually a really interesting point when it comes to this election. I think it's an overlooked part of it, but with Trump, I find it really interesting this appeal for Trump amongst the commercial fishermen, especially when it comes to immigration. A lot of fishermen are against immigration. When the fish processing plants are run entirely, and I'll say entirely by undocumented immigrants. It's not a secret. I've spent a lot of time talking with these people, also incredibly hard workers. Oh yeah, working long hours. Very young people with families. Some of them, mostly from Guatemala, Central America. Absolute bottom of the barrel in terms of the wages, the working conditions. But it's also the backbone of this entire region's economy. Without the processing plants, the fish would not be able to be sold. You can't sell fish off the back of a boat. And
one of the largest processors, Roy Innickson, himself an immigrant.
That's right.
Roy Innickson himself is an immigrant.
That's one of the really interesting things is the fishing industry has always been this essentially like a ladder or a gateway of immigrants to come into this country, like the Portuguese, or like the Norwegians.
Oh, the Norwegians are incredible.
Like the Portuguese came, worked in the fish houses, a lot of them.
Yep.
You think about Carlos Rafael, right?
Yes.
He's a perfect example. Worked in the fish houses as a kid, an immigrant kid.
Yep.
Eventually bought a boat. Eventually bought 40 boats and became a millionaire. He has made over $100 million selling his fleet. Sure, the ways he made that money are a bit nefarious, but Yeah, I mean, this anti-immigration impulse is interesting, and I really think, misunderstood amongst the fish industry, that their industry would not be really anything without the immigrant labor.
We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Stick around. Welcome back to the program. I'm Chris McCarthy. We have Will Sennott here. So, Will, what's the next thing you're working on? Well, you don't have to disclose to us, but what should we look forward to coming from your pen?
Is a book.
Okay.
That's what I'm going to be focusing on for the next as long as it takes. I mean, I think I said on this before. Yeah, I have a kind of floating offer from a publishing house. I've been working on it for the last 6 to 8 months. Realized it's a lot harder than it looks,
right?
And going to be dedicating a lot more time to that moving forward. So this is probably the last interview I have on here for a bit.
Hopefully, then you'll be back with a book
until I come back with a book.
You're always welcome back here, Will. I really appreciate your journalism, the way you've embraced what you do. Right?
Thank you.
You became a part of your stories. I mean, it really is amazing. Going out in the fishing boats and all of that stuff, and I think you do a great job. And the New Bedford Light, I think, is a fine publication. I look forward to seeing you again, my friend.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I do too.
So, folks, we have the New England Patriots that are coming up this Sunday, right? This Sunday, it's Patriots against the Bears. Kickoff's at 1 p.m. Pregame on WBSM begins at 10 a.m. So, the Patriots in Chicago against the Bears. Kickoff 1 p.m. here on WBSM. Now, all season long, we've got the New England Patriots here at WBSM. So, folks, God willing, I'll be back on Monday, right? God willing, I'll be back on Monday. I want you to have a beautiful weekend. Stick around. We're going to have a little bit of Bill O'Reilly, then a lot of Barry Richard, and then some Howie Carr after that. So what I want you to do is, no matter what side of the election you're on, just embrace it. Be happy you're in America, right? We're talking about these immigrants, illegal and otherwise, who come to America. You were lucky enough to be born here, many of you. And those of you who got a green card, welcome to America. I'm glad to have you, right? So if you didn't win the election, you won in life because you're living in America, right? You could be in the Ukraine dodging Russian bullets right now, right? You could be a Russian dodging American bullets fired by a Ukrainian. Don't cry in your Cheerios, right? Cry in your beer. It's America. You're the luckiest person in the world, really. Really. Even if you're the unluckiest person, you're the luckiest person in the world because you're in America, right? It's an amazing country. And we can whine about the elections, whatever. They kill people in other countries when elections don't go their way, right? You just get mad and do whatever, right? Get a tattoo or something stupid. I mean, think about it for a second. You're an American. God love it, right? So God willing, like I said, I'll be here on Monday. God bless America. You celebrate it. You're an American. Enjoy it, right? Whatever you're going to do, head to the Profile Tavern, have a couple of beers, have a pizza, right? Do whatever you want. It's in America. You live in America. Like every day, I can't get over the fact that I was born here, right? You ever lived in Israel? Will Sennott has, right? Think about what's going on in Israel, right? Think about what's going on in the Ukraine. We have great elections. It's going to be we're going to make America great again, right? God bless America. God bless WBSM. God bless you, the audience. So we'll take you out of here with a little bit of music. I think.
There's a cowboy in the jungle, and he looks so out of place, with his shrimp skin boots and his cheap cheroots and his skin as white as paste, heading south to Paraguay, where the gauchos sing and shout. Now he's stuck in Portobello since his money all ran out. So he